Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Ortiz, and I am the Special Education Program Specialist for Walnut Valley Unified. I'm glad you all were able to take the time for today's presentation. We are going to record today's presentation, and then it will also be shared on the, I think it's a Google site, is that correct? On your shared site. As people enter in, if you're able to mute yourself for the background noise and you can use the chat if along the way. I'll do my best to be able to pause or check the chat with questions that you have. I know that especially now during distance learning, writing goals can be challenging because getting information from the students is even more challenging than in person. So I'm hopeful today, as far as our goals, is to give you an overview so that you can be able to implement this formula once we do return in person. In addition, being able to give us some time to have some Q&A, be able to answer questions that you might have specific right now to distance learning and writing goals, because we are having to be a bit more creative in that way.
It was weird that it was just like long silence. I'm trying to figure out. And then I looked at it, and then I realized, like, oh, her mouth is moving.
I'm looking to see, Julie, if I don't know if I have the ability to be able to mute people as I go along.
I taste you.
I can. So I'll take care of that for you, and I'll also monitor the chat. Erin?
Oh, great. Okay.
Questions, I'll let you know along the way.
Okay, that sounds great. All right, so we'll get started. So in looking at developing defensible goals, there is a formula, and the formula is handy, but what's more important than the formula is knowing the why. And I'll say this from being a teacher myself. I was both a general education teacher. I then transitioned to become a special education teacher, and now as an administrator. And so I do understand and have been in your position before where you're preparing for an IEP, and then where you are presenting your goals to both the team and the parents. And sometimes the parents decide to bring guests with them, whether it be family friends or advocates or whomever it might be that might be representing them. And the why of these goals is really going to be important for you to be able to have I guess just a deeper professional understanding so that you can explain and justify the whys of your goals. That's why you'll see in here, I'm not going to reference goal banks. I'm not going to reference templates of cut and pastes, because we have gotten into an era where individualizing is really important for you to be able to know the student in and out and be able to explain the goal. Having said that, I think it does make sense for you to know which essential standards are go-tos for your goal writing in different areas in language arts and in math. So it absolutely makes sense for you to have kind of some language or verbiage for certain standards and those goals, as long as they're being individualized from there. So when we're looking at a sequence, this is what I generally refer to with the staff that I work with.
I really need this one. I need to know.
And in connecting the dots, what we always start with, whether it be an initial or a tri-year, is assessment. So you're doing this before even any annual as well as you teach. Assessment doesn't have to be formal. It can be informal. The piece to assessment that I wanted to point out is the juicy stuff is in the analysis, being able to take the information that you get of, let's say, how many words per minute a student reads or what their reading level is, and being able to analyze it. That's where you're going to get the information that you need as to what skill you want to target for your goal. And so that assessment information will lead into what I just spoke about, which will be your present levels. And for those of you that are becoming more familiar with the IEP paperwork and the IEP pages, that is the next step to where it tells us or gives us a snapshot of what the student can do and what they are not able to do yet. And we also would refer to that as strengths and weaknesses. And oftentimes when I am looking at goals for compliance, I go to the present levels and then I go straight over to the goal and I check the baseline for the goal. That verbiage should look really similar. It doesn't necessarily have to be cut and paste, but some providers choose to do that, which is absolutely fine. When your IEP is being checked for compliance either by your site or district staff or by somebody outside of the IEP, that's what they're going to be looking for. They're going to be connecting the dots because they don't know anything about the student other than what they see on paper. And that's where, as what sometimes may seem the IEP paperwork is exhausting at times and may seem when we present pretty didactic, it really should somehow come alive or be able to make the student come alive to whomever is reading it or picking it up to implement it. So the other analogy I use with staff that I work with is that the IEP document tells a story of the student. That's probably my teacher in me that I relate it to that, but we want it to be able to tell a story. So from our present levels will take us to our individualized goals. This talks a little bit more in detail, and I'm not going to read the screen to you guys because I know that you can go back and reference it, and I would encourage you to. That's something I did as practice as a teacher. I would go back, especially with the tougher cases where I struggled with a goal for some reason in a certain area with the student. I would go back to my references like this to help me get through that. But I will point out some of the highlights. So the present levels of performance, it is really important to label and note what the student can do. Now that doesn't mean we need a whole list of what they can do since they entered school at 5 years old. It is something that is relevant, obviously, to their performance level or maybe even their grade level. And then what you want to be cautious of when you are talking about what they cannot do, their area of weakness, is that you want to really focus on what are they ready to learn. Because again, there could be a very long list of what the student cannot do. So whatever area of weakness that you are describing in the present levels, that should relate directly to the goal, because that is you identifying their area of need. So once you identify that area of need in the present levels, we would look to see a goal in that same area. So I'll give you an example. I've often seen in the area of math calculations, a provider will or a teacher will have tested and found out that the student struggles with multi-step calculations, money, and fractions. And so I might see that on the present levels because they took that directly from, let's say, the Woodcock-Johnson or the KTEA. And then their goal is only in multiplication calculation. And there's nothing about money and there's nothing about fractions. So that would be a gap or an area that we would need to develop goals in if you're identifying it as an area of need. So I hope that that's clear. I'm going to pause actually just a moment to see if there's any questions about that to clarify.
Yes, there is a question in the chat.
Okay.
And the question is, if I'm writing an IEP, do I write an IEP goal based on standards for the student's current grade level or for the grade level they will be at next year?
That's a good question. So I'll address that later in more detail in the presentation, but yes, you are going to be writing towards grade level standards, not for the following year. Now, the only time you might determine that you may want to write a goal for the following year is if you're approaching the end of a school year and you're holding the annual at that time, and the majority of that student's IEP is going to be implemented during that next school year. Then you may consider to write for the next.
And there's another question, Erin. It says, should there be a goal for each need?
Yes. So if you are identifying an area of need, then you would be writing a goal for that. So connecting back to the example, your description in, let's say, your assessment report, let's say it was an initial or a try, and you were explaining their performance, what they can do or what they can't do based on that standardized assessment. In your present levels of performance, your weakness is the weakness area or the area of need should be specific to what they are ready to learn. It's the weakness that they are ready to work on. It would not be all of the needs under math, because there are so many strands and standards, let's say, under math, that you also don't want to write too many goals because then you wouldn't be able to implement the IEP. So it would be up to you as the teacher expert to be able to identify what standard or area is most impeding the student from participating in Gen Ed. What is the most important area of remediation?
Okay, there's another question, Erin.
Okay.
Can we have a grade level goal and a goal that is at the student's level, lower grade level?
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that as well. Your I guess I'll call it instructional level goal should spiral towards a grade level goal. Now, I'll give some examples when I get to that and we talk about aligning them to standards, in that you may have a middle school student who is not able to decode, and there is not a 7th grade language arts goal that is related to decoding. And so we'll talk about how to be able to take a grade level standard and spiral it down, and or ensure that you have grade level standards for each area, meaning for language arts, for math, or for writing, if that is the case. And if you have multiple goals in language arts, if you have a decoding goal, and in addition you have a reading comprehension goal or a vocabulary goal, that you are able to write one of those goals to the student's level. The important thing is that you have a goal that is connected to a grade level standard for each area of concern. But we'll talk a little bit more specifically. I'll pay attention to that when I get there.
All right, and one last question about goals, just real quickly. How many goals should you write that's reasonable?
It depends on the student and their need. Yeah. Okay. So looking at when you do get to the goals and objectives, of course it would be specific to their need, not just, well, the program that we use focuses on figurative language, so I wrote a goal for figurative language. We never want to write a goal to a program. You want to write the goal to their area of need. And then your objectives, which I know each district does things differently, so I won't give a blanket guidance to this, other than if you do use objectives, benchmark objectives that you write out separately in your annual goal, or within the goal page, I should say, then those objectives you want to look at as steps towards the annual goal. And those are what you're going to use to measure or give progress towards the annual goal. Some districts do not use objectives, and you are just reporting on the annual goal at each benchmark date. So it really is dependent on your district for that. The other dot that gets connected is we have needs, we have goals, and now what services are needed to implement the goals. And so there should be a service connected to all the goals that are proposed. What I wanted to point out that kind of sticks out to me with this, and we may talk about this later in more depth, but there may be a student that receives a consult service or a collaboration service from you where you are essentially there for maintenance. Maybe it is the student isn't ready to exit yet and the team doesn't feel quite comfortable with exiting the student quite yet, but they're participating in only Gen Ed with just accommodations. So there should be a goal that is attached to that consult or collaborative type service. Whatever service and goals should somehow match up. And so one of the things in terms of guidance from our Office of Administrative Hearings, those are the people that look and decide upon cases in regards to filings related to special education, to IEPs, and when they look to review for compliance or make their decisions, they look for the appropriateness of the placement of the student, meaning where the student is receiving their instruction, can only be examined by looking at the implementation of goals. So our goals are really the heart of our IEPs, and that's why we're spending a whole afternoon on them.
And one question, Erin,
Mm-hmm.
can there be too many goals? This person says they have a student who struggles in all academic areas and has 7 goals, and he's having a hard time meeting any of them.
There can be too many goals. I have a slide on that as well. So we can talk more specifically about that case when we get to the Q&A. But yes, too many goals, like I mentioned before, makes it difficult to be able to implement the IEP. So, okay, some guidance from our Department of Ed says that the goals that you propose, that you write, should be able to be reasonably accomplished within a 12-month period. It's great for us to have high expectations for our students, and we should, but know that when you write the goal, sometimes I see a teacher seeing so many areas of need, and I see one goal that may have like 3 different goals within it. And so that goal may not be reasonable for that goal to be accomplished within a whole year. We just want to ensure that we're looking at scaffolding. What's the next step for the student, and write a goal that is reasonable. Within that, it should be really clear for anybody to be able to know how the goal is measured. To be able, and we'll talk a little bit more again about that as we break apart or break down the formula for goals. We spoke about this already, about aligning it with state standards. And one of probably the more important parts is that when you see a student struggling, being able to meet frequently to review that progress and or review the goal if necessary. Students receive progress on their goals during as frequently as every reporting period. So that might be 4 times a year or 3 times a year. However, if a student is making little to no progress, then the team should really be meeting because something needs to change, right? Whether it be the instruction or maybe the goal, whatever it might be. Did I have more questions, Julie, before I go into the overview? No? Okay.
Gotta unmute myself. Nope, no, none so far.
Okay. Okay, so this is the overview. We talked about the assessment using the grade level standards, talking about what they can and cannot do. Scaffolding the goal. This is helpful if you do decide or you do use objectives. I've found that this is a helpful way to explain to parents, how are you going to teach the goal? What are the teaching steps to get the student to reach that goal in a year? And I feel like it just helps bring the idea of the goal a bit more concrete for the team and the parents. I know that some districts and sites, or even some providers, may prefer to use just a change of percentage instead of, if the annual is at 80, bringing it down to 70, 60, 50. And I do know that it's it's best practice to be able to scaffold those objectives, to know and make clear, what are you going to be measuring during that 3-month period or that 4-month period, whatever it is that you're marking progress. So these are things to consider before even drafting the goal. Gathering multiple forms of evidence, getting your progress from possibly multiple teachers if they're in secondary, or multiple service providers. Talking with the parents ahead of time, whether it be via phone or email, this is probably one of the things that makes the biggest impact in running a smooth IEP and coming with goals that the team is ready to agree upon, is just getting their input. It doesn't have to be really specific, but I know, like I shared, what I grew into doing and what was really helpful for me along the way was making the phone call to the parent maybe a week before the IEP. They knew that the IEP was coming. They had it on their calendar, letting them know these were the areas I was seeing of continuing writing goals in. Did you have any concerns that you want to share with me? Are there any areas for goals that you are hoping to see, or any areas that you're concerned about? We didn't go through the verbiage or anything like that, but it just gave me good input prior to writing the goals, because parent participation, even though we're writing them as the educational expert, their participation is of course equal to ours. And when we're looking at legally defensible IEP goals, that will definitely be one of the things that is asked upon by a judge, is, did the parent have input with these goals? And by doing a step like that, it really does help build the relationship and get you started off on the right foot even before the meeting begins, because the parent has a connection with you and they already feel heard. And then hopefully you can cut through some weeds if you hear of any concerns ahead of time. Talk with your team, whatever it might be. So that's really, I would say, if you're going to have a takeaway from this, it would be contacting the parents to get their input regarding goals. The other piece that, of course, is important is the evidence or data that you have, possibly instructional aids, whatever it is that you've gathered up until that point, to be able to support why you're writing the goal and what their levels are. Being able to review, whether it be from their gen ed teacher or again in secondary from their multiple teachers that they have, what their grades are like. And so that way you can see any flags, red flags that might be there occurring. Okay, so within the umbrella of legally defensible goals, they're to be written in areas of unique need. So this attached to the question of somebody asking, do we need to write goals in every area of need? So the area of need would equate anything that impedes the student being able to access their education. And so we know that education isn't just academics, it's also emotional, health, vocational. And so that is where this second statement that is attached to, attached to case law. And this matches your present levels page, your present levels of performance. And that's why we have to report on all of those areas that a student is able to take care of their adaptive needs at school, so it's not an area of concern. It's just our way of being able for us to say, yes, we checked into that, and this is what they're able to do, or this is an area of need. Again, I would caution if it's age appropriate for them to not be able to be independent in a certain area. For instance, if it's age appropriate for a third grader to not know how to organize their materials yet, not know how to write their assignments down every day without assistance, if all the third graders in Gen Ed need somebody to, some kind of checking system to make sure that they're writing their assignments, do not include that as an area of need, because that's age appropriate for them to have that need. So you only want to write to areas of need that are not age appropriate or outside of their grade level expectation. Okay, this address to, so yes, it does have to be to each area of need, but it does not mean, I know 50 is like extreme, so forgive me for that, but it does not mean that you need goals for each skill. We simply need one goal for every area of need. So if there is a vocational need, let's say for a middle school student who is not turning in their work in a timely manner, they turn in their work late for all their teachers. Sure, they have an accommodation that says they can turn in their work late, but there's no growth, there's no movement. They turn in all their work late. Well, then that's an area of need because they really should be turning their work in on time. So that could equate to an executive functioning goal for vocational area, for them steps to be able to teach and support them to turn in their work in a timely manner. That's just an example of that. Did I have any chats? Any questions in the chat?
No, there was just one question asking if they can get a copy of the slides, and I will make sure that everyone gets that.
Oops, I think I went too fast. Okay. Okay, so the first step outside of our assessment and present levels is creating strong baselines. And again, in using the term legally defensive IEPs, looking at it with the lens of a parent's legal representation or of a judge, is that those baseline are based on the needs from the student's disability, and that could include, as it relates to progress in their Gen Ed curriculum, including post-secondary transition, because that would include your transition planning as well. So there would be specific information as you can give to the baseline that will really be helpful, again, just to connect the dots. So if you look at this last point where it says where possible, the baseline should follow the goal formula. That makes it really easy then to measure. If you already know that a student is solving equations with variables at 40%, you can put that, if you did a trial or whatever it is in your assessment, you can put that in the baseline, and then that can equate really easily to the goal that you write in that area. And then when you check for growth and progress every 3 months or so, and then again at the annual goal, it will make it really concrete. Where did they start? What was the goal? And what was their performance on the goal? I know that isn't always possible, but that I would say is as much as you can match the baseline with the goal. That will make it easier for you.
Erin, there is a question. Where could we find strong goals besides the goal bank? Is there another resource to find goals that we could then adapt to the specific needs of the students?
I would first look at, like I said, first starting with their weakness or their area of need, and then you're going to look to the state standard, and you're going to look at some of the verbiage or the concept within the state standard, and then you're going to think about from that standard, what would that trial or what would that lesson look like? And so you're going to kind of connect those, the need, the baseline information, and the state standard to be able to identify what the goal would be. So outside of, like I said, utilizing the goal bank is a good start, but then you want to be able to individualize it. So if you know your student struggles with, let's say in writing, right, with visual motor or with expression, possibly with language expression, the state standard may say multiple paragraphs, but you are going to write, and currently the student can write 3 sentences. You're going to write an annual goal, taking them to not multiple paragraphs, but maybe just focusing on the components of a single paragraph, of a 6-sentence paragraph, or whatever it might be. So it doesn't mean that your annual goal will match the standard, but it should be approaching. So as far as a guide to writing strong goals, you're going to want to use the standard as your anchor, and then you're going to adapt it based on your student. Okay. So the question of, can I use the scores from the last assessment report as a baseline? I see this happen often, maybe sometimes just even with certain schools, not even just with certain providers, but this could just be kind of like a general practice of, that's how we always do it, or that's how our school site does it, or maybe even district as a whole. And there's nothing that prohibits that. Those standardized assessments, of course, are conducted for a reason. However, in regular practice, it often does give too, in my experience, too little. Sometimes it might give too much information, where you might end up with it appearing like there's more areas of need than there is. But I find that it usually gives too little information, because it doesn't correlate to what they're doing in class. It doesn't correlate to standards. It's a standardized assessment for the sake of eligibility. It's not a standardized assessment in terms of my everyday curriculum necessarily. So I would encourage, if you do use, let's say, Woodcock-Johnson or KTEA standard scores, to say, look, there is a weakness in reading comp and reading comprehension. It doesn't really tell me what areas of reading comprehension. Is it the literal, detail-based questions, or is it the analytical and inferential based questions? I don't really know. And they struggle in reading comprehension. Are they 1 year behind? Are they 3 years behind? It doesn't give much specifics to help you write a defensible goal. So it's not that you can't use it, but I would caution against it being the only evidence in your present levels. Okay, so we're going to look at this. The student, as if it were a baseline. The student is not yet able to read with grade appropriate fluency. The student is not yet able to identify structural patterns found in informational text. I feel like this is almost kind of obvious, right? Would we say that these would be defensible baselines? Maybe if you use your reaction, your thumbs up or down, and your captions or whatever they are. Does this give like concrete, or?
If you're not sure where those are, if you click participants, you'll see those right at the bottom of the choices for participants.
Okay, yeah, so I just in looking at the chat as well, it looks like most of you are seeing that these are not defensible baselines. It doesn't give me any quantifiable information regarding what the student's level is, what they can do, and any real specifics as to what they cannot do. Something that, an example of what could be an adequate baseline or present level would be after a DRA, which we know is a type of curriculum assessment. Anytime you are referencing levels or scores, it's important for you to include where you got that information, where you got that assessment. So this reference DRA, because then I know when I measure the annual goal, I'm going to use that same assessment. Because, right, we can't compare apples and oranges. We need to be able to be consistent with our comparisons. When I've gotten into sticky cases before, I've, of course, argued in defense of my teams against advocates and or lawyers for this to explain there's multiple forms of assessment to measure a student's level. But what they always go back to is, right, there is, but what you used for this goal was the DRA. So what you need to use for the annual goal should be the same assessment, because that's where you're getting your baseline information from. And so those are some of the dots that when they really get nitpicky that you'll want to look at. So I'm not going to read this through, but you can just see that it's a lot more specific in terms of the baseline. So it creates a clearer picture, again, in the story of the student. It gives you a better idea of what the student needs are. Okay, here's another practice, and that a baseline showing the student's listening comprehension skills were significantly delayed, as demonstrated by the need for test items and questions to be repeated multiple times. The student also had difficulty following directions and comprehending verbal requests. So we know that they struggle with. They struggle with following oral directions and or understanding what they're being told what to do. They need for things to be read aloud to them. And when they are read aloud, they still struggle. But we don't really know to what level. We don't know to what capacity they are able to work in that area. So that's where you'll see some of these notes of what does significantly delayed mean. Is that a year below? Is that at what grade level? You know, we're not quite sure. Some of the pieces of a baseline of who, what, when, why questions, and we'll talk about that more when we look at the formula, that we don't get that in this baseline. And then there's additional information about this extra sentence. Had difficulty following directions and comprehending verbal requests. That is like another skill, right? That just gets added on. So we want to try to steer away from adding on those additional items, or else they end up becoming goals that we have to write. Okay, so here would be an improvement from what we just saw. Currently, the student answers what, when, who, and why questions with this percentage, 20% accuracy, when what? When a grade level paragraph is presented. So it doesn't just say instructional level paragraph, because we don't know what that is. It's really specific that it's to their grade level paragraph. And then here would be the goal that would attach. You can see it has the same verbiage of what we used when we tested their level, or when we identified it. What types of the W questions, and when given a grade level paragraph. And then of course it has the other components of the goal, of the accuracy and trials and how we measure it. Okay, looking back at our state standards, and I saw in the chat there are some districts, so if you are interested in goal banks, I would approach whether it be maybe your mentor or somebody within your district that is your support, because some districts do provide that. In Walnut, we don't, other than what's on SACE. So I'm just going to take you through as if you didn't have any kind of goal bank for reference. Okay, being able to use the standards to backwards map. And by that meaning, we're going to scaffold down the standards. So I gave you the example of a multi-paragraph essay and scaffolding that down to a student writing a single paragraph. I've had before where students tend to have single paragraph goals. It seems like almost every year after year. It might be a narrative paragraph one year and then an expositive paragraph the next year, to where finally as an IEP team, before meeting with the parent, we said, if they're not able to write a single paragraph, is this the goal we should be writing? Should we be teaching the student sentence structure? Should we be focusing on simple sentences versus complex sentences? So even though the standard might have multi-paragraphs, you want to bring that down to where the student need is, and you'll still reference that goal, that skill of a student learning how to write complex sentences that connect to one another will lead them to being proficient in their grade level goal. So even though the annual goal that you propose does not match the state standard, as long as it connects in a spiral-like way, you're compliant, okay? Of course, you always want to be cautious not to scaffold down too much. We want to keep challenging the students. And we also want to look at goals that don't have state standards related to them. I talked earlier about an example of an executive functioning goal of having a student, what was it? I just lost it. Oh, having a student submit their assignments in a timely manner. And there's skills that would be taught to support them with that. But that isn't related to a statewide standard. That would be other educational benefits. I think there's a box to check for that. Is there any chats that
Yes, we just got a question.
Okay.
Can objectives be student independent grade level and have goal at student grade level? I'm not sure.
So what I think that may have been, if I'm understanding it correctly, is that the goal can be, oh, let me look at that. Maybe the annual goal is related to the grade level standard and the objectives are smaller skills that are at the student's independent level. Yes, that would definitely be appropriate because that would be what we consider as a scaffold to that. That would be appropriate. Mm-hmm. Great question. Okay. Does the standards-based IEP imply that the student is performing at grade level in that content area? Of course not. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a goal in that area. If they are performing at grade level in a content area, they shouldn't have a goal in that area. They wouldn't have an area of need if they're performing. And now performing is not just grades. I know that gets a little tricky sometimes with some students in some cases. It might mean they're getting an A in math. Why are they going to have a goal? That makes sense. Now, they may have an A in math, but score below on the standardized assessment. That's when you want to look at assessing in multiple ways of curriculum-based assessments and standardized assessments. What we will always say with the standardized assessments is that high scores don't lie. Anytime a student might score in an average or above average in whatever area, let's say reading comprehension, that score is not going to lie. That they are, it's not just a bunch of lucky guesses. When they are scoring below, that's when we want to look a little bit closer and at maybe other curriculum. If they're getting an A in math, but they scored below in math reasoning, we want to look and see maybe it's their accommodations that are assisting them to get an A in math, despite having a math reasoning deficit, things like that. It really is kind of like a case-by-case basis for that. Okay, so we talked about our strong baselines, and that's how our strong goals are written. So we need to be able first, of course, to have our present levels and baselines to know where to be able to start the goal for the next IEP. We talked about following the goal formula for the baseline, and oops, I have a hard time reading my last sentence. Oh, there it is. If there is no baseline, or if the baseline is super, what's the word, slender, like there's not a lot of meat to it, we're going to end up with a non-compliant IEP, especially if it's in an area of need. Now, if it's not in an area of need, something like, I'm just going to throw this out there, but maybe an adaptive skill. The student's able to take care of their personal needs at school. They're able to navigate the campus. That's all you really need for that. You don't need data taken and all of that kind of stuff. You already know it's not an area of need. But if you have a goal in reading comprehension and your baseline says they're reading below grade level, we're not really compliant. We don't have enough baseline information to write a compliant IEP. Oh, that was a repeat. Sorry. A repeat slide in there. I'll remove it before I share the right one. So here's some of our formula, and these SMART goals should look familiar to all of you from probably either past experience and or in one capacity or another, is that there's specific criteria, that's our baseline, information of where we know we need to begin, that it's measurable. We're able to use those action words, so it's not just the student will display or the student will show. You know, we want to be able to have more specifics, those action words, ensure that it's realistic and it's relevant to what the student need is. Again, I remember seeing examples in the past of middle school students that had, for language arts, for reading, had figurative language goals. And that was it. There was no other reading comprehension goal. And they really just had vocabulary, but they were reading below grade level. So that goal wasn't really relevant to the student's core or essential need. Okay. So this kind of breaks it down a bit more in that it is specific. So if we look down here to these two options of course, which one is more specific? If you even look at these words, student will increase study skills or student will identify key evidence by, so it paints a better picture in your mind. If you were to show up as a sub and be given this goal for the student, or even as a tutor, if you were giving this goal as a tutor to be able to focus on or plan your lesson around, you would of course prefer the latter goal. That gives you more specifics so that you can pick it up and know, what does a student need to do? Okay, well, I need textbook and notes, and then they need to scan for key evidence, as opposed to, will increase study skills for academic success. You know, those are some vague vocabulary words. So we want it to be specific. Measurable is what ties into what your baselines were. And again, if we look down at these different options, it makes it really clear to anybody who is looking at it, what am I going to see at the end of this goal? So it's really clear, let's say to a parent, that at this time next year, my child's going to be given 10 questions and they're going to answer it with 80% accuracy. Not just a year from now, my child will improve his reading skills. You know, that's doesn't really give a clear quantifiable, that's a word, quantitative picture. Okay, this is what I was talking about earlier with the use of clear action words. So I'm going to bring you back down to the example again. The first one is looking at decrease her anger. but what would that look like? And that's what I tend to, when I'm either helping staff write goals or I am reviewing them to check for that they're clear and that they're defensible. I do look at what does it look like, and in reading the goal, does it give me a picture of what it looks like? So this second one is really gives you a good picture. If my goal is for her to decrease her anger, how is she going to do that? What is that going to look like? Well, she's going to remove herself from the environments that cause her to lose control so that she has no disciplinary notices. So that quantifies it as well. There's going to be no disciplinary notices. And that relates to decreasing violating school rules. So that gave a clear picture. Some of the examples up here show with no more than 2 verbal prompts. You're probably used to seeing goals written like that, that give something that is quantifiable in their description, in the action words. Okay, so we're writing goals obviously related to their needs, not to specific programs or to specific assessments like benchmarks. We use the district benchmarks to see areas of need or possibly, hopefully, growth in our students, but we're not writing goals to those tests. We're not writing goals to those programs. We're writing them specifically to their area of needs. And so that those examples are pretty clear as to which is realistic or relevant. I spoke about a similar example to this of being descriptive and how they will write a paragraph and or improve their spelling skills. Okay, so with your benchmark dates, again, that's usually every 3 times within the year, and the parent will get the copy of your goal page, and you are going to write some sentence or 2. Usually 1 sentence is sufficient to say what that data is for that student. What progress are they making? That is not for made some progress, made no progress, or making good progress. The dangerous thing with reporting in that way is not having the evidence when you get to your annual goal of really what that progress looks like. If you use those vague words or good or some, which used to be drop down options for us on SACE for progress reporting, just ensure that you've got the evidence or the data to be able to show what type of growth that the student is making based on those different intervals. Okay, so when you're looking at compliance, after you draft the goal, and I know this takes more than just 1 sit down, so you may start with a goal and you may draft it 4 or 5 times over, or I should say revise it 4 or 5 times over. Whether you do this in 1 sitting or you go back to it, this is a good checklist to be able to review as far as for compliance piece of by when. This is usually pretty an easy one, by the annual date, when given the task. So you want to be specific of when given 10 word problems or whatever that might be. The student will, it's important to use their name as opposed to just student. Again, if you look at this IEP as a story of a child, and I always remind myself sometimes when I go to IEPs and I'm not always looking forward to, that this parent, as whatever I might think professionally towards, this is their whole life. You're talking about their student, or I should say their child, who's their whole life. And so I think it lends itself for us to be able to use the student's name in the documents as opposed to the word just student. That's important. Again, what is it that we're targeting? What's the target skill? And making that observable instead of will improve their reading comprehension level. We want to be specific to that. Will will increase or will answer inferential questions when given after reading a grade level text, whatever that is, just to make really clear what that target behavior or skill is. And that behavioral one it referenced will remove herself when experiencing frustrating situations or something like that. The proficiency, the 80% accuracy doesn't match with everything. Sometimes we're tracking something on a daily basis, and so it could be in 4 out of 5 days or something like that. You may not always use the 80% accuracy. I always like the example that I've heard in the past, and that we sort of get caught up in that we don't realize how it sounds. Will raise their hand 80% of the time during a lesson. Well, it's like, how do you measure 80% of raising your hand, right? You either raise your hand or you don't. It's not like you raise it like halfway, or it's so. Don't feel like you always have to use that percent. You do need proficiency, but it may not always equate the 80% accuracy. So that's just something to keep in mind. For frequency, oftentimes people will use 3 out of 4 trials or something like that. You might also choose to use 3 consecutive trials. So that really is dependent on your preference or what you're measuring. And then being specific to how it's measured. I talk a little bit in another slide about teacher observation and why to be cautious in using that as your only form of measurement. I tend to put teacher charted data because that observational data can be put into a quantifiable reporting sheet, as opposed to teacher observation tends to lend itself to look as more anecdotal. And there's a lot of questions that go into that, which I have on a different slide. So we'll go into that then. Is there any questions in the chat before I keep going?
We just got one.
Okay.
Says, what would you recommend stating? 3 consecutive trials or 3 consecutive opportunities?
Either is fine. Yeah, whatever the preference would be. Both are compliant.
And also earlier, I missed this, we had a question. What does DRA stand for?
Oh, it's a curriculum-based reading assessment. Yeah, it was just like any other, I guess. They all have their different names, just depending, just the name of the assessment. Okay. Somebody spoke about this before, which I thought was a great example. Your objectives are like scaffolds for the annual goal. So you may choose to make the objectives more relatable to the students' performance level. And again, I view it as the objectives are ways to be able to show how I'm going to teach it, the steps to teach towards the goal. And those should also be specific and measurable as well. Okay, so looking at this, by this date, Johnny will improve his counting skills and increase attention during math lessons with 100% accuracy. 100% is like, I can't do anything 100% in my life. I can't even imagine a child being able to. So just something to think about as well. I think we can guess with this one as far as a yay or nay is nay. As opposed to this one, at this date, when given a small group instructional setting, 3 to 4 peers, that's really specific, I can see what that looks like. Johnny will identify quantities of 1 to 5 in random presentation with 80% accuracy or higher as measured by teacher charted data. So if I were to show up as a sub or as a tutor, I know exactly what I'm going to do with Johnny. I know what he needs to work on, and as opposed to increasing math skills or something like that. Okay. You likely have heard this before, the stranger test. I feel like this is something that is referenced often with goals. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have heard this again before in some other context. But we're looking at, can anybody pick it up and read it and know how to implement it and or measure it, so that that goal should be able to be understood by someone that is not a teacher. That goal should be able to be understood as somebody that's not an educational professional. Because again, one of the important pieces when we look at legally defensible IEP goals is that all of this is comprehensible and understandable and something that parents agree upon and they understand. Not to say that they would implement any of this, but that's one of the things that is questioned when we look at goals. This is a helpful checklist that just reiterates some of the different points that we went over. I won't read these aloud to you, but this is a helpful reference guide. And I would look to using this checklist, especially as you're starting off with learning how to write goals, and definitely before any kind of IEP you feel a little bit nervous about. You feel like the parent might challenge you. This is definitely a good practice to be able to sort of have this pregame with yourself and or maybe members of your team together. Another piece that's important as you are developing goals, and I'm not going to get too much into it because these are the other parts of the IEP, even though they all sort of connect, is what accommodations are needed so that the student can have success with these goals. What are some of the adaptations to their environment that are needed to give them access to put these goals into practice or into play. So that's just something to keep in mind as you move further along, that your accommodations are going to connect to your goals. Okay, and progress reporting is super important. If a parent does not get a progress report and you have committed a procedural error and possibly have denied their student FAPE, meaning if the student, let's say, is making slow or no progress, parent didn't get any progress on the goals, they don't know that until the year later, we've lost a whole year of learning, right? In their book, in their argument. So it's so important that you send those progress reports home, that you are monitoring progress. Because if you see a student slowing and or plateauing and not making progress, that's a good time, pick up the phone, share the information with the parent, talk to the team and say, I think we need to meet as a team. Don't ever feel like it's on your shoulders only. You're one member of a team, and so that kind of information is good for the team to come together to say, why is this happening? What can we do to address the slow growth? It might mean a revision in a goal. It might mean a change of service. Maybe the service needs to be increased. Maybe there needs to be a revision of accommodation. So that's the team's obligation to do together. It doesn't just fall on your shoulders when you see that slow or no growth. Now, oftentimes I'll see sometimes on the first reporting period, there may be limited growth towards that goal because maybe the teacher hasn't had enough time to have enough instruction or practice or trials towards that annual. As long as you know the why, as long as the parent understands and you understand the why and you want to keep going with the same goal, that's fine and it makes sense. So there's no like one answer to it other than ensure that you're monitoring it. And if there's slow to no growth, it's our obligation to hold a meeting and discuss if there's any changes that need to be made.
Erin, there's a question. How do you handle that during distance learning right now? I have quite a few students who are struggling to meet goals, even the short-term objective goals.
So my assumption is that these were goals that were written prior to COVID. And so the setting, of course, was different. And that's where I would communicate with parents. I would do everything you can when you do check progress on those goals to see if you can get information of where the student is working or performing. If there are so far off that, and let's say the student's IEP is not till the end of the school year, then it probably does make sense to use your new baseline data from your distance learning goals to be able to revise it. It doesn't mean you need to throw the goal out and write a whole new one, but maybe there does need to be a revision. Again, it might depend on when that student's annual goal is.
Okay, Erin, we have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
One, this is something I hear from a lot of my special ed teachers right now. Many students are not submitting assignments or participating during Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know if you want to address that first, and then I'll go to the next question.
Sure. Yeah. That limited participation or possibly not turning in assignments could look a couple different ways. So let's say if a student is just not participating and not showing up, well, of course, there's different steps that you would take as a team to be able to meet and see what adjustments might need to be made in the distance learning plan. Obviously, you're not looking to change your offer of FAPE because that should be whatever it is when we return back in person. But then the students have this emergency distance learning plan where they have different expectations. So you're going to want to investigate more with your team as to the why are they not participating. And every district is probably in a different space with this, but let's say there is accessibility issues, then some districts have opened up their sites to be able to allow students to do distance learning on campus so that they don't have issues with accessibility. It may be that the student needs prompting or assistance. Let's say our students with more moderate disabilities or even severe, and so they don't have the support and or even capacity with the support to be able to participate in the same way as they would be in person. So again, that can lead to a lot of different avenues depending on where your district is in regards to that. But having said that, you can make adjustments to their distance learning plans. And what I would say on my end, what I've worked with my teams in doing is seeing if the parents or whomever supporting them at home are amenable to offline assignments so that you can get some kind of work or work samples, knowing that it might not be valid, of course, or as authentic as it would be in person, but it's some kind of work that you're getting in return. That really wasn't like a great answer because that question is so big, I would say, and that going to either your site-based admin, your principal, or the district-based admin to help for the students that are not participating at all.
And to lead off of that, there's a question. One person said they're having their students not come and they can't get a hold of parents. Mm-hmm. And another one asks, what do you recommend to use as baseline data when participation is limited in Zoom and assignments might be facilitated by the parent?
Mm-hmm. That is where there's not a whole lot of go around that you can do. I encourage my teachers to, when they are trying to gather data, to schedule a meeting with the kids individually, or especially if they're not participating in the small group. If they can't get what they need within the small group, to be able to schedule them for an individual session to be able to, as best as they can, get the trials that they're looking for. If that is a case where they're getting the assistance at home, of course, we always thank the parents for supporting them, because I know that is, that's not always easy, and we want to appreciate the support that they're getting. However, we want to then probe and ask the parents, how much help did they receive with this assignment? And you could just narrate that. Is that assignment was completed with adult, maximum adult support, whatever that might be. In terms of your goal writing, you're going to have to write the best goal that you can based on that information, and then just know in the back of your mind when we come back to in-person, there's probably going to be quite a bit of revisions that are made to our IEP plans, because that's just the situation we're in.
And then one more, someone said, I have been asked to discuss an alternative curriculum for a third grader because it was discussed during the last IEP. The student has had slow growth. What accommodations again?
So an alternative curriculum to me sounds like you're talking about a modified curriculum. I don't know if you might be referring to an alternative distance learning plan, which would be different than a modified curriculum. But if I understood it correctly the first way, then that would be a modification in the student's IEP if their curriculum is not related to
I think it will be changed from mild to moderate severe.
Oh, okay. Oh, so a change of placement.
Yes, a change of placement.
Okay.
I have a new teacher, so I've had the student for like a 6-7 months. I've known the student for about 7 months because I'm a new teacher there. So I know he's slow at learning, but I don't want to make a big decision like that. But I don't know. I'm just frustrated.
Is it the general education teacher that is asking you?
No, the SPED supervisor, director, SPED, the ones who put together the IEP meeting, because we will be having an IEP soon. And she said that's that with the alternative curriculum with the parents, so she'll start knowing.
Oh, okay. So what you can do in your placement, you can provide modifications in your placement without changing the student's placement to like a small class or whatever that might be. But a change of placement to something that's more restrictive, like you're talking about, should come with an assessment, like a standardized like an assessment plan before restricting their environment. But it sounds like she may be guiding you to say, add more modifications into their curriculum, see how the student responds, because that's what the student might need when we return in person is more about like an all-day modified curriculum, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, I'm going to be asking her. Thank you.
Okay, and you answered another question right there, but we have one more. This person said, I've been using record review and scheduling one-to-one to informally obtain data and get parent input. Is this appropriate? Yeah,
usually that comes within guidance of your school psych or maybe your district or site-based administrator. And I would not recommend that for an initial for a student that is not in special ed yet. Record review, there's not really any records other than their report cards to be able to review. But oftentimes right now, because of where we are, our teams are conducting more record reviews of for triennial assessments to be able to determine if the student is still eligible. Having said that, we all know we're running the risk that we don't have a defensible assessment because it's a record review. So when we do return in person, we may have quite a bit of students that we have to reassess or to assess differently, but it still falls within compliant borders, I guess, or lines for what you described. Good to keep moving. Okay. One of the things when you're looking at measuring your goals is obviously with data collection, you want to keep in mind what factors are in place when you are collecting that data. This is not just related to behavioral data, although it can span both behavioral and academic curriculum. But you want to think about, because hopefully you're using your instructional aids to help you with this. because this should not all fall, they're there as support, and this is a good task to train them in. And that's kind of the key word, is that whomever might be taking data for you, you want to ensure that they're trained. If you are not able to train them on your own, reach out to somebody within your team to be able to help you, so that you're all working smarter and not harder, because this job can be so hard. And so hopefully you're able to use your instructional aids to some capacity. Of course, you're still going to take data, but just ensuring that whomever you do have taking data is trained in whatever form, knows exactly what they're looking for, etc. And I talked about this earlier about observations. Observations are totally fine to use as a measurement tool. Just keep in mind that you want to include the time, the place, and maybe the manner in which the observation took place. That will be important when you are using it as evidence.
Okay, Erin, we have a question.
Sure.
I have a student that was supposed to be assessed prior to COVID. Progress is still very limited since we can't recommend a more restrictive placement without formal assessment. Based on your discussion, modifications can be placed in the current program. Can you give an example of some of these modifications?
You know what, I'm going to look at it. Sorry, one more time. I'm going to look at the chat so I make sure that I read this the right way. Oh. Okay. Oh, okay. Do formal assessments always have to be done to recommend them? Was that what you were reading, Julie?
I was reading the right below because you did answer that question
okay.
about formal assessments.
I have a student. Okay. Oh, okay. So without knowing the student specifically, because it would be probably specific to that student, I would look to include modified curriculum. So let's say for language arts and or math, that the curriculum provided to them would not be gen ed grade level curriculum that is adapted. It would be a modified program for them. Another modification could be that the way that they're assessed, that means that their assessments would not look the same as what the gen ed assessments would look like. It would be based on their modified curriculum, or if it is an assessment based on their gen ed class, let's say that in the area of if I'm looking at the curriculum as a whole, let's say the area of science, they're in third grade and they have access to third grade science, but their assessment of what they know might look a bit different. So they're not assessed on all the areas that all the other students were graded on for that chapter. They may just look at what is more functional. So that I would, without knowing the student, it's just sort of off the cuff what I would think of as far as modifications. Within distance learning, their modifications may mean that they have more breaks, less time on screen. They may have where it looks more like maybe hourly check-ins on screen, as opposed to being sitting on the screen for hours at a time. They may have different offline assignments that are provided to them than what is provided to the rest of the students, or that the other students are completing online. If that, I don't know if that, hopefully that gives you some kind of gist. As if there's something that is more specific, we can talk after and I can maybe give you more examples based upon that specific student, getting more info. For students that are English language learners, this is just a reminder of how to be able to look at addressing their needs within their IEP goals. Oftentimes, of course, it might be listening, speaking, reading, or writing. And so this just gives an example on how to be able to take the standard, obviously look at their language level and what is aligned as the English learner goals and standards, and being able to see where a language arts goal can match, whether it be in reading or writing or beginning reading, whatever that might be. Essentially, any language arts goal you have, if your student is EL, you're covered, you're compliant. You just want to make sure you check that linguistically appropriate box, so that way it's made aware that you know the student is an English language learner, and that you are and that you're addressing their needs within their language arts goals. This is actually just like a one-page reference as to what we looked at more in detail in the previous slides that we broke apart in separate slides, but this is just a one-page reference of drafting goals. And these are, towards the end of this, is just really tips. So things to avoid, the vague language, thinking about what is this annual or this result going to look like, being really specific in your measurement as you go through, and some takeaways. We talked already about the importance of the parent input, being able to look at the student as a whole, not just the standardized assessments, but also the curriculum-based information or data. Something to know, because we'll get sometimes into discussions with parents. The goals must be attainable, even though they are appropriately ambitious. Sometimes parents may feel like the goal is too easy, even though you know your student well, so you know what they're capable of. A compliant or a defensible goal is that, or the obligation, I guess you'd say, is that the goal must be attainable. In addition to being appropriately ambitious, they must be attainable. And so that's something that you can, I don't want to say defend, but you can explain when you explain your rationale for your goals. We talked already about the goals being flexible and ensuring that with progress checks, we are evaluating how students are doing. I know that is a hot mess right now with distance learning. Very few students are meeting goals that were written pre-COVID. So just keep it in mind, I guess, with moving forward, drafting new goals for this year, knowing that when your students return in person, they're going to have learning loss. And so your attainable goal that you write this year might look different than what you would have written for them on any other year. And that's okay. Too many goals can really complicate and stop you from fully implementing the student's IEP. So you really just want to stick to what you see as key. And as long as you have a goal in each area of need, you don't need multiple. And you don't need multiple in reading. You don't need multiple in writing. This one came up actually for me today at work. You're not required to include goals that relate to all areas of general education. I had a parent today that asked for a social studies and science goal. And when in reality, the student's language arts goal addresses their needs in those areas. And so in those areas. So don't feel like you're obligated because your student happens to be in a self-contained science class or a self-contained social studies class that you have to have a goal in that area, because you don't, as long as likely their language arts goal relates to the skills that they use in science or social studies, you're covered. When a student doesn't meet a goal, you want to make sure you're addressing why. So using some kind of revision or adjustment, because the student is changing grade levels every year, and you're never going to have a defensible goal by just repeating it the exact same. It's okay for a student not to meet a goal. If they don't meet a goal, then they don't meet the goal, but you'll need to be able to look at how to be able to revise it so it meets their needs and addresses the next grade level standards. This is something that I remind myself of all the time because we get tired and there's so many components, and I'll say, when in doubt, have somebody else read your goal. Have somebody else read your IEP. It could be a peer, it could be somebody else on your team, it could be anybody, but it's really helpful to have another set of eyes because when somebody's looking at it objectively, that's what judges do. They're connecting the dots that we kind of went through. The goal amount and type of goal is dependent. Oh, okay. So when we're looking at goals, we just want to ensure that there's a corresponding service with that goal as well. And you guys have heard this before, the Andrew F. FAPE standard is that the program should be appropriately ambitious in light of student circumstance. This could be another helpful talking point for you when you explain your rationale for a goal for a student that may have, let's say, even more moderate or severe impairment, and a parent may want for a goal to be higher than what you have drafted. And this just ensures that the goals or what we provide the IEP should be appropriately ambitious in light of the student's disability. So you're using their functional levels, not just a grade level standard. Okay, I see the chat going off, and I think we're coming close to the end too. So let me.
We are. We have one more question.
Sure.
If a student doesn't meet a goal, do you need to rewrite it, or do you just make a completely new goal?
Depends on what, I guess, to what degree they met the goal. I've seen before both. I've seen where a provider will revise that same skill, revise the goal using that same skill based on where what amount of growth the student did make towards that goal. I've seen providers say this student didn't meet the goal, however, they've made adequate progress towards that skill, and we're going to focus on this next new skill. It really is just dependent on the student. What I would say is not do is just don't just cut and paste from the previous year if they haven't met the goal.
Okay, that's great. First of all, I want to thank you, Erin. I'm sure everybody benefited a huge amount from this. It's super helpful, and especially all of your answers to those questions. Thank you so much. We will be sharing this recording and the slideshow to everyone who participated today. So thank you so much. I must have the correct email if you're here, so you should be able to get it. And there will also be an evaluation sent out tomorrow for this presentation so that we can give Erin some feedback and so that Cluster 4 can get some feedback as well. But thank you all for being a great, respectful, polite audience, and for sticking through and learning all of this, even after a very, very long day of teaching. So we really appreciate it. And if you have anything that you'd like to talk to Erin about for just a couple of minutes, because she's had a long day as well, stick around. But otherwise, this completes this PD session. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you, everybody.